I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. The headlines from Africa dominated by Ebola. The frightening outbreak in West Africa, now said to include 2 Americans and a European. The question ahead, of course, is can it be contained to West Africa given the jet aircraft? And also a new experimental drug. That is part of the questioning now because that drug, called ZMapp, has been given to the non-Africans so far. However, it's experimental, and so far, according to the reporting of the Associated Press, 1,700 Africans who have become sick by Ebola have not received the drug. That's part of the larger story of vaccines or violence in Africa. Michael Shank, writing opinion for Reuters. He is at the Friends Committee on National Legislation, fcnl.org. And Michael calls upon his experience when he was on the Hill working with Africa. Michael, a very good evening to you. The Ebola story is so fresh, it's overwhelming. So we'll say fog of war and get on to the details of vaccine or violence. The Pentagon, these last months, and certainly over the last year, routinely announcing operations in Africa. I note the search for Boko Haram's victims, the young women who were taken in North Nigeria. And we were told that there was a search out run by the DOD, perhaps out of an airfield out of Chad. That's an example of the Pentagon. But at the same time, what about medicines? You had experience when you were on the Hill in Cameroon. Is that an emphasis of the Obama administration? Do we learn anything from the recent summit about vaccines rather than violence? Good evening to you, Michael.
Good evening. It's good to be here. Thanks for having me on the show. What the Pentagon, and to a large extent every U.S. administration, has prioritized in recent decades, but you're seeing this just in the last few years, the Pentagon ramping up activities on the African continent, staging almost 600 military exercises in the last year, and that's a 200% increase since 2008. Overwhelming prioritization of military activity, whether that's drone strikes, airstrikes, military training, equipment, advisors on the ground, sending 100 advisors to Uganda as an example. But whether it's Libya, whether it's Mali, whether it's Somalia, Nigeria, our primary role in terms of investment, and you're looking at $1.8 billion in 1 year, has been in military aid, and then arms sales have totaled $800 million, almost $1 billion in arms sales alone. So have we prioritized vaccines? We haven't. Now, certainly the Bush administration, the Clinton administration, the Obama administration have given some dollars to aid, and that's included some health education, and certainly vaccines have been a part of that. But those are in the single millions or the tens of millions, but not in the billions in comparison to what we've done militarily.
You use an example of your time, your experience in Cameroon. First of all, what was the challenge and how much did it cost to treat vaccines rather than violence in Cameroon?
Great question. So the mosquito nets that we distributed with the government there that are insecticide treated, that canvas a bed and prevents the sleeper from getting any kind of mosquito bite in the middle of the night, which is when they most often happen, which passes on the malaria, which is what we were trying to prevent. Mosquito net costs $10 per bed, and so if you look at the $1.5 million that we gave Cameroon in military aid and the additional $7 million in arms sales to Cameroon, that $8.5 million could have bought almost a million bed nets, 850,000 bed nets. So very cheap to do a lot of this preventative stuff when it comes to health and when it comes to preventing epidemics in West Africa or any part of the African continent.
Michael, the puzzle here is also geopolitical because there's a conversation that the United States is late to this game, that China has moved in very effectively, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. Perhaps self-interest is involved here, natural resources, but also good relations with governments. Does the United States have a competition now that we need to look at? It's not just the U.S. vaccines versus the U.S. violence, but it's other state actors as well.
Yeah, part of the competition is that China is providing real services, infrastructure, buildings, roads, bridges to African countries. Now, some of that's poorly made, and so some of the countries are pushing back against China's resource investment. But our oil companies have been very active on the African continent, whether it's East Africa or West Africa. So it is a bit of a race for resources. Ultimately, the countries and the leaders on the continent want development and growth. The key is sustainability, and they've seen poor practice from oil companies in the U.S. as well as poor practice from Chinese companies that are looking at infrastructure. So I think going forward, people just want their lives bettered, and they want sustainable livelihoods. So in Somalia, where I was last fall, they're not keen to see more drone strikes and airstrikes. They're keen to make sure that the youth, the thousands of youth running around Mogadishu, unemployed and listless, have a job and don't get recruited by al-Shabaab as a result.
You mentioned the drones. I do not have specifics on the drone effectiveness in Africa, but I know over a long period of time, the drone use in the borderland between Afghanistan and Iraq has done just as much damage to U.S. relations with Pakistan and Afghanistan as it has done in effectively combating al-Qaeda and the Taliban. Is that something we can generalize about in Africa? Do drone strikes in Somalia or drone surveillance in Chad or Mali or Niger, you take my point, is that an effective way to use U.S. resources? Are we resented for it, celebrated for it?
Not at all effective. We are resented. I was working in Pakistan in 2002, 3, 4, and 5 when public sentiment there and opinion there was pretty pro-America, and 10 years later it's been all but destroyed, eviscerated by that drone program that you mentioned. I don't see it effective. It terrorizes a population in psychological ways. When I was in Yemen this year, people are very conscious about the drones circling above, and it creates this palpable fear. So not only is it creating actual destruction, physical destruction, but it's also creating fear in populations that doesn't engender pro-American sentiment.
There's a photograph accompanying your opinion piece at Reuters, and I understand you don't choose the photographs, but it illustrates a challenge here for me. It pictures the very handsome and effective U.S. Special Operations Command Africa Commanding General Brigadier James Linder shaking hands with the Nigerian military officer, this during a military exercise, Flintlock 2014. The name is awfully suggestive of where we're headed here, which was a U.S.-led international training mission. Now, that looks very vigorous, but this is Nigeria, the most populous state in sub-Saharan Africa, ripped by Boko Haram and other conflicts, with Goodluck Jonathan announcing, we presume, yet another term despite some promises made over these last years, and now Ebola. So the U.S. military looks like the wrong face to offer a troubled Nigeria. Is that your observation, Michael?
Absolutely. The Nigerian military has been accused through many surveys and studies of human rights abuses. And here's the problem with a lot of our military assistance to these countries, is that these countries are guilty of serious human rights abuse throughout the population. And what Obama has tried to do recently is push through a counterterrorism partnerships fund at $5 billion that would not be held to any kind of law that we have in the U.S., like the Leahy law, named after Senator Patrick Leahy, that would prevent military funds from going to countries, leaders that have a track record of human rights abuse. So there are real problems here in terms of who we're aiding and abetting on the ground. So
that photograph then encapsulates in some fashion the whole wrong direction that's underway. With Ebola victims threatening the whole of West Africa, we have a handsome general who's backed up by guns.
That's correct. There's so much more we could be doing if we ultimately wanted to partner with countries on the ground, whether it's good governance, whether it's sustainable development, that could allow us to continue to aid and partner with these governments. And if it's a competition on China, we have a lot of room to grow here, but the current modus operandi with military-first approach isn't working. Michael
Shank, who is at the Friends Committee on National Legislation, FCNL.org is the website, writing for Reuters Opinion. I'm John Batchelor. This is The John Batchelor Show.